History remembers Alexander the Great as a brilliant commander who conquered half the world by the age of 30. But what if a darker reality lay behind the glittering facade of his great victories? What if this king, who was called the son of a god, committed acts worthy of a demon? Today we will lift the veil of secrecy on those pages of history that official chroniclers preferred to keep quiet. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and let's get started. Alexander the Great became famous as a conqueror who built empires, but his actions in Persepolis showed the other side, a destroyer capable of wiping entire symbols of a foreign culture off the face of the earth. In 330 BC, he captured this city, which served as the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, and instead of preserving its splendor, he set the palace on fire. Ancient authors such as Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus describe this event in different ways, emphasizing either a calculated approach or an impulsive act. According to one version, the burning was a deliberate political move. Alexander wanted to demonstrate his complete superiority over the Persians by breaking their spirit through the destruction of the main symbol of their power. The palace in Persepolis, with its massive colonnades and halls decorated with gold and precious stones, embodied the grandeur of the Achaemenid dynasty. Burning it down meant not just destroying a building, but erasing the memory of an entire era, equivalent to someone in our time setting fire to the Kremlin or the Capitol to declare a new power. It was an act designed to have a long-term effect. The Persians were to understand that their past had been erased and their future belonged to the victor. Another version, recounted by the same historians, paints a picture of chaos and passion. During a feast where wine flowed freely and courtiers and courtesans swarmed around the king, Alexander succumbed to the persuasion of Thais, an Athenian courtesan. She reminded him of an old grievance. A century and a half earlier, the Persian king Xerxes had burned Athens, including its sacred temples. Thais suggested responding in kind, and the king, inflamed by wine, agreed. Here is a sketch of that night. The shadows of torches dance on the walls of the tent. Laughter and music drown out the voices of reason, and Alexander, with a cup in his hand, suddenly stands up, his eyes burning with a feverish gleam. He leads his retinue to the palace, and already the first tongues of flame are licking the carved reliefs depicting kings and gods. Smoke rises to the stars, and the guards stand frozen, watching as columns several times the height of a man collapse. The fire destroyed not only the architecture, but also countless treasures, including golden statues and ancient relics. Historians argue about the motives. Plutarch leans towards the version of revenge, emphasizing the role of Thais, while other sources see it as a symbolic gesture, perhaps even with a hint of ritual, where fire clears the way for a new era. The short-term consequences were immediate. The Persian nobility lost the center of their identity, which weakened their resistance to Alexander's conquests. In the long term, this event influenced cultural exchange, as the Greeks later drew on Persian art, but with the loss of the originals, much was lost forever. The most affected were the Persian elites and artisans, who lost their heritage, as well as the Macedonian army, which saw the king not only as a strategist, but also as a destroyer. A common misconception is that Alexander burned the entire city of Persepolis, but in fact, the fire mainly affected the royal palace and adjacent buildings. Residential areas survived. This myth arose from exaggerations in later accounts, but archaeological excavations confirm the limited scale of the fire. Another misconception is that Thais was a minor figure. In fact, She accompanied the army and wielded influence, like many women in the entourage of military leaders of that era. Consider a modern-day example. Think of a man in his mid-30s who, having achieved success in business, decides to destroy a competitor's company not just by taking it over, but by completely erasing its brand and archives. This is reminiscent of Alexander's actions, a mixture of strategy and emotion, where victory requires sacrifice. Loyalty was highly valued in Alexander's army, but one incident showed how thin the line between loyalty and fury can be. In 328 BC, during a campaign in Central Asia, the king committed a murder that stands out for its personal nature. He personally pierced Clytus the Black, one of his closest associates, with a spear. Clytus was no ordinary soldier. He had served at court since the days of Alexander's father, Philip, and had distinguished himself in battle. At the Battle of Granicus, several years earlier, Clytus had saved the young king's life by blocking a Persian warrior's blow with his shield. This act of heroism strengthened their bond, making Clytus almost a brother-in-arms. However, during a banquet in Samarkand, everything changed. The atmosphere became heated with wine and arguments. Clytus, being older and more experienced, began to praise Philip, implying that Alexander's achievements paled in comparison to his father's. The king, who already claimed divine status, took this as an insult. This is how it might have looked: a noisy hall filled with warriors in tattered armor, wine cups overflowing, and the air heavy with smoke from braziers. Alexander, sitting at the head of the table, suddenly blushed with anger, his voice drowning out the general hubbub. Clytus, not backing down, declared that true glory lies not in worship, but in deeds. In a flash, the king grabbed his spear and struck. Clytus falls, blood spreads across the floor, and silence reigns, interrupted only by the heavy breathing of the culprit. After the murder, Alexander, according to sources, showed remorse. He wept, refused food and drink for several days, and even tried to kill himself, but his comrades restrained him. Historians interpret this behavior in different ways, as genuine grief or as an attempt to restore his authority in the eyes of the army, which was shocked. The short-term consequence was tension in the troops. Many veterans doubted the stability of their leader, which led to growing discontent. The long-term impact affected Alexander's reputation. This episode became an example of his impulsiveness, influencing how subsequent generations saw him not only as a hero, but also as a man with dark traits. Among the groups affected were the Macedonian nobility and commanders, who lost their sense of security. The murder of a friend showed that no one was safe from the king's wrath. Alternative views exist. Some scholars, relying on Arrian, suggest that Clytus himself provoked the conflict while drunk, while others see it as a symptom of Alexander's growing paranoia. Debunking myths. It is often claimed that Alexander killed Clytus in a fair fight, but sources clearly indicate a sudden attack during a banquet without a formal challenge. Another misconception is that his remorse was entirely feigned. Plutarch's writings describe it as profound, with elements of self-flagellation, which does not fit with the image of a cold manipulator. For a real-life example, let's take a situation familiar to many people in their 30s and 40s. Imagine a childhood friend who saved you in a difficult moment, say during a financial crisis, by lending you money. Then, in the heat of an argument at a party, you hurt him in a way that cannot be undone. This echoes distantly in the story of Alexander and Clytus, highlighting how personal relationships collapse under the weight of pride. Ultimately, the burning of Persepolis highlighted Alexander's strategic cruelty. while the murder of Clytus revealed his emotional instability, creating a contrast between the calculating conqueror and the impulsive tyrant. But the king's madness was not limited to drunken outbursts of rage. It began to permeate the very structure of his court, turning it into a cold, calculating system that demanded absolute obedience, not only in body, but also in soul. The next step in this transformation was an attempt to introduce proskynesis, a Persian ritual that was a symbol of slavery for any Greek or Macedonian. This was not just a bow. Proskynesis involved falling prostrate before the monarch, touching the ground with one's forehead, and sometimes even kissing the ground at his feet. For the Hellenes, raised on the ideals of freedom and civic dignity, such an act was sacrilegious. Only the gods deserved such worship, and to demand it of a mortal was to put oneself in their place. This step was not spontaneous. It followed Alexander's visit to the oasis of Siwa in Egypt, where the oracle of the god Amun, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus, proclaimed him the son of the deity. When he returned from the desert, Alexander was no longer just the king of Macedonia. In his own eyes, he had become a living god, and proskynesis was a natural expression of this new status. Imagine a veteran Macedonian who had gone through fire and water with Alexander, who had seen him wounded, bleeding, sweating and tired like any mortal. And now this man, whom he considered his commander, his comrade, demanded that he, a free warrior, fall before him in the dust like a Persian slave. This was not simply a violation of tradition. It was a breach of the social contract, a betrayal of the common values on which his entire army was based. Resistance was inevitable and came from the very heart of his entourage. The most ardent opponent of proskynesis was Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, and the official historian of the expedition. During one of the feasts organized specifically for the introduction of the new ritual, Callisthenes gave a speech in which, according to Arrian, he drew a clear line between the honors due to humans and the worship due to the gods. He argued that mixing these concepts meant humiliating both the gods, depriving them of their exclusivity, and people, taking away their dignity. This was not just criticism, it was a philosophical rebellion, an intellectual challenge to tyranny. Alexander, upon hearing this, harbored a deadly grudge. He saw in Callisthenes' words not only disobedience, but also a threat to his new divine image. The king, who had conquered half the world with his sword, found himself powerless against the force of words and persuasion. This smouldering hatred soon found its outlet in one of the darkest episodes of Alexander's reign, the conspiracy of the pages. The pages at the Macedonian court were not mere servants. They were the sons of the most distinguished aristocrats who served the king personally, accompanying him on hunts and campaigns. It was a kind of military academy and school of court life from which future commanders emerged. In 327 BC, one of the pages, Hermolaus, overtook the king during a hunt and killed a boar with his spear. Alexander, enraged by this breach of etiquette, ordered the young man to be publicly flogged and stripped of his horse. Humiliated and insulted, Hermolaus, according to the official version, organized a conspiracy to kill the king. The conspiracy was uncovered, and a brutal reprisal began. Hermolaus and his accomplices were subjected to the most severe torture in order to extract confessions and the names of other participants from them. And here the shadow of the paranoid king fell on Callisthenes. The historian, who was the tutor of the pages and openly opposed the deification of the king, was immediately accused of incitement. There was no direct evidence of his guilt, except for vague testimony extracted under torture from the dying young men. But for Alexander, that was enough. Callisthenes' fate became an exemplary intellectual execution. He was not simply killed. According to one version, he was transported behind the army in an iron cage, like a wild beast, on public display, until he died of disease and exhaustion. According to another, he was hanged after agonizing torture. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's future successors, wrote that Callisthenes was torn to pieces. Regardless of the details, the outcome was the same. A man who dared to speak the truth and defend the ideals of freedom was destroyed with demonstrative cruelty. It was a message to everyone else. You can question the king's tactics, you can argue about his strategy, but you cannot question his divinity. Alexander no longer tolerated dissent, he demanded absolute faith. The murder of Clytus was a crime of passion, but the destruction of Callisthenes was a cold, calculated act of a tyrant who exterminated not only bodies, but also ideas. Alexander's demonic plan extended beyond court rituals and the suppression of dissenters. He conceived something unprecedented, to reshape the very fabric of society by mixing the blood of the victors and the vanquished in a gigantic social experiment. In 324 BC, in the city of Susa, he organized a grand mass wedding. It was not a celebration of love, it was a political ritual of colossal proportions. On the same day, Alexander himself, along with about 80 of his top commanders, and, according to some sources, up to 10,000 ordinary soldiers, took noble Persian women as their wives. Imagine this scene. A huge tent decorated in Persian style, golden thrones, incense, exotic music. Macedonian military leaders, men whose hands are accustomed to swords and whose bodies are covered with scars from Persian arrows, sit next to women they do not know, the daughters and sisters of those they killed on the battlefield. They do not understand their language, their customs, their world. It was a forced union, political theatre, where people were mere puppets in the hands of the king. Alexander himself set an example by marrying 2 Persian princesses at once, Statira, daughter of Darius, whom he had defeated, and Parysatis, daughter of the previous Persian king. In doing so, he symbolically united the 2 dynasties. For many Macedonians, this was not a fusion of cultures, but a capitulation to them. They had fought for years to prove the superiority of the Hellenic world, and now they were being forced to accept barbaric customs. Alexander even paid off the debts of all his soldiers to sweeten the pill, a gesture that many perceived as bribery. "I am buying your consent to betray your brides and your homes," is how the soldiers, who dreamed of returning to Macedonia to their families, might have interpreted it. This chilling ritual showed how far Alexander was willing to go in his megalomania. He did not simply rule over people, he tried to create a new race, a new people born of his will. It is telling that as soon as Alexander died, the vast majority of his generals immediately divorced their Persian wives, proving the artificiality and violence of this union. Alexander's cruelty was not limited to his immediate circle or large-scale social projects. It was also evident in his military policy, turning into methodical extermination. After the death of Darius and the fall of the Persian Empire, thousands of Greek mercenaries who had served the Persian king found themselves without work and without a master. For them, it was just a job. In divided Greece, mercenary service was commonplace. But for Alexander, they were traitors to the Hellenic cause. He gave an order that turned his army into a punitive force, to track down and destroy all Greek mercenaries in the territory of the former Persian Empire. It was not a war, but a hunt. Macedonian cavalry units combed through the satrapies, searching for scattered groups of Greeks trying to either find a new employer or return home. They were not taken prisoner, nor were they offered the chance to switch sides. They were surrounded and slaughtered. It was a cold-blooded purge, motivated not by military necessity, but by vindictiveness and a desire to establish a monopoly on violence. Alexander demonstrated that he alone had the right to decide who the Greeks could fight for. Anyone who made a different choice was to be destroyed. This campaign of terror against his own countrymen showed that his concept of Hellenic unity was merely a smokescreen for his own imperial ambitions. Unity under his rule was mandatory. Any deviation was punishable by death. The bloody epilogue to this story came after the king's death. In 323 BC, at the height of his power, Alexander died in Babylon. His departure was as dramatic and mysterious as his life. Lying on his deathbed, feverish, he is said to have whispered, when asked to whom he was leaving his empire, "To the strongest." If this is true, it was his last and most destructive act. He did not appoint a successor or leave a will. He simply abandoned his vast empire, made up of dozens of nations, to be torn apart by his ambitious generals. This was not the gesture of a wise man, but the final act of chaos from a man who believed that after him the deluge would come. And the deluge began. For 40 years, his former comrades, the Diadochi, tore the empire apart in bloody wars. But the most terrible victim of this struggle was his own family. As if dark karma had overtaken his lineage, all who bore his blood were methodically destroyed. His Persian wife Roxana, who bore him a son after his death, was imprisoned in a fortress with little Alexander IV. For years they lived in captivity, pawns in a great political game, until finally, when the boy turned 13, they were secretly killed on the orders of Cassander, one of the Diadochi, in order to eliminate the legitimate heir. His second wife, Statira, was killed by Roxana almost immediately after her husband's death, out of jealousy and fear for the future of her child. Even his mother, the powerful and cruel Olympias, did not escape this fate. She herself actively participated in the wars of the Diadochi, ordering the execution of her enemies, but in the end she was surrounded by Cassander's troops and sentenced to death. She was stoned to death by the relatives of those she had killed. The entire dynasty, the entire family of the great conqueror, was wiped out. The man who called himself the son of a god and conquered the world could not even protect his own child. His legacy was not a stable empire, but a bloody massacre that consumed everyone he once loved or was supposed to protect. His demonic energy, which created the greatest empire of antiquity, ultimately turned against itself, devouring its own creation and its own blood. To understand the nature of this demon, one must look into his childhood, into the snake pit of the Macedonian court, where intrigue was in the air and poison was a frequent guest in the cups. His mother, Olympias, was not just a queen. She was a priestess of wild, chthonic cults. A princess from Epirus, she brought mysticism and primitive fury to the rational Macedonian world. Ancient authors, without hiding their horror, described her participation in the orgiastic rituals of Dionysus, where, with her hair loose and surrounded by tame snakes, she fell into an ecstatic trance. It was she who instilled in the young Alexander the idea that his true father was not the mortal King Philip, but Zeus himself, who appeared to her in the form of a snake. This idea, sown in a child's mind, bore monstrous fruit. Alexander grew up convinced that he was a demigod, that ordinary human laws and morals did not apply to him. He was the chosen one, and his every desire was the will of the heavens. His relationship with his father, Philip II, only exacerbated this internal conflict. Philip was a brilliant commander and politician, but he was also a rude, drunken, and dissolute man. He both admired and feared his son's talents. The conflict reached its peak at Philip's wedding to the young Macedonian Cleopatra. The bride's uncle, Attalus, drunkenly proposed a toast to the marriage, producing a legitimate heir to Macedonia, openly alluding to Alexander's half-Greek ancestry on his mother's side. Enraged, Alexander threw a cup at him. Philip drew his sword and rushed at his son, but, being dead drunk, he stumbled and fell. "Here is a man who was going to cross from Europe to Asia," Alexander said sarcastically, "and he cannot take a step from one bed to another." This episode was not just a family quarrel, it was a public humiliation, a rift after which Alexander and his mother fled the capital. Shortly afterwards, Philip was killed. The official version was revenge by an offended bodyguard, but too many details pointed to a conspiracy. The assassin, Pausanias, was immediately caught and killed by Alexander's associates, preventing him from naming those who had ordered the killing. Olympias, returning from exile, staged a ritual execution of Philip's last wife and her newborn child, forcing Cleopatra to commit suicide. Alexander himself immediately eliminated all potential pretenders to the throne. Historians still argue about whether he was involved in his father's murder, but one thing is certain. Philip's death cleared the way for him to seize power. He ascended the throne knee-deep in blood, and this became his usual way of solving problems. The first manifestation of this demonic will was the destruction of Thebes in 335 BC. This ancient and glorious Greek polis dared to revolt, believing the false rumor of Alexander's death. The young king's response was not just cruel, it was apocalyptic. After a short siege, the city was taken. Alexander did not negotiate, nor did he execute only the instigators. He convened a council of allied Greeks, who, fearing his wrath, sentenced Thebes to death. The city was wiped off the face of the earth. All the houses, temples, and theaters were destroyed to the ground. The only exception was the house where the poet Pindar once lived, a cynical gesture demonstrating that he valued dead art more than living people. About 30,000 inhabitants, men, women, and children, were sold into slavery. Imagine caravans of desperate people wandering in chains along the roads of Greece, former citizens turned into commodities overnight. With this act, Alexander sent a chilling message to all of Hellas. Resist me, and you will cease to exist not only as a state, but also as a people. I will erase you from history. His obsession knew no bounds, which was fully evident during the siege of Tyre. This Phoenician island city, located on an impregnable rock half a mile from the shore, refused to let Alexander in. Any other commander would have bypassed it, but for Alexander, it became a personal challenge. He decided to do the impossible, to connect the island to the mainland. For 7 months, his army built a giant dam under constant fire from the Tyrian fleet. Soldiers died by the hundreds, storms destroyed the embankment, but the king, obsessed with his idea, drove them forward. When the dam was finally built and the city was taken by storm, his revenge was terrifying. About 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the massacre, 30,000 were sold into slavery. But even that seemed insufficient to him. To teach the whole world a lesson, He ordered 2,000 surviving men of conscription age to be crucified along the coast. Imagine this nightmarish scene. Rows of crosses stretching for many kilometers along the seashore, with people dying in agony on them. Their moans mingled with the cries of seagulls and the sound of the surf. It was not just an execution, it was a ritual of intimidation, a picture of hell created by the will of one man. This cruelty was fueled by his growing belief in his own divinity, which was reinforced by constant rituals and prophecies. He did not begin any important undertaking without sacrifices. His personal soothsayer, Aristander, constantly interpreted omens for him: the flight of eagles, the entrails of sacrificial animals, drops of oil on water. Each sign, of course, was interpreted in favor of the king, convincing him and his army of divine protection. This transformed his campaigns from wars of conquest into a sacred mission, where any atrocity was justified by the will of the gods. The murder of Clytus, for example, took place during a festival in honor of Dionysus. For Alexander, raised by his mother in the traditions of this cult, drunken madness could be not just a loss of control, but a sacred frenzy, a moment when the god enters his devotee, relieving him of all responsibility. He did not simply kill a friend. Perhaps in his distorted mind, he made a sacrifice to the god of wine and fury. The height of his contempt for human life, even the lives of his own soldiers, came on the return journey from India through the Gedrosian desert. His army, exhausted by years of campaigning, refused to go further east. It was the first and only time his soldiers openly defied his will. Humiliated and enraged, Alexander decided to punish them. Instead of choosing the familiar and relatively safe northern route, he led his army through one of the deadliest deserts in the world. It was pure madness. There were no roads, no wells, no food. For 60 days, the army, accompanied by thousands of women, children, and merchants, trudged through the scorching sands. It was a death march. People and animals fell from heatstroke and dehydration. When rare wells were found, soldiers drowned each other in a mad scramble to get to the water. Provisions quickly ran out, and starvation set in. The soldiers slaughtered their pack animals and then their own horses. Alexander walked with everyone else, sharing their hardships, but this was only part of his diabolical plan. Once, scouts found some muddy water in a dry riverbed and brought it to the king in his helmet. In front of the entire army, tormented by thirst, he slowly poured the water onto the sand, declaring that he would not drink until all his men had drunk their fill. This gesture went down in history as an example of leadership, but in reality, it was the height of cynicism. He himself had led them into this hell, and now he was playing the savior. According to various estimates, between 15,000 and 40,000 people died in the Gedrosian desert, more than Alexander lost in all his battles. He sacrificed an entire army to his wounded pride. This was not just a tactical miscalculation. It was an act of genocide against his own people, a ritual purification through suffering, where he acted as the high priest, leading his flock to slaughter in the name of his ego. Emerging from the desert, he staged a grand, drunken orgy, a carnival lasting many days on carts, as if celebrating not salvation, but a successfully completed sacrifice. This icy paranoia, which had metastasized in the king's soul, found its most terrifying embodiment in the case of Philotas and his father Parmenion. Parmenion was not just a commander, he was a pillar of the Macedonian army, a loyal comrade of Philip II, a man whom Alexander trusted to guard the treasury and the rear, while he led the troops forward. His son, Philotas, commanded the elite cavalry of the Hetairoi. In 330 BC, Philotas was accused of knowing about a conspiracy against the king, but not reporting it. The evidence was flimsy, based on rumors and reports from jealous rivals. But for Alexander, this was enough to set in motion a diabolical mechanism of retribution. Philotas was arrested and, unthinkable for a Macedonian aristocrat, tortured. He was tortured in front of the king's closest associates, turning the trial into a bloody spectacle. Under unbearable torment, Philotas incriminated himself and many others. But the most horrific was yet to come. While Philotas was still being tortured, Alexander had already sent messengers with a secret order to Ecbatana, where the unsuspecting 70-year-old Parmenion was staying. The messengers, including the king's confidants, arrived at the old commander's residence, handed him forged letters, supposedly from his son, and stabbed him while he was reading them. Alexander feared that, upon learning of his son's fate, Parmenion would raise troops loyal to him. Therefore, he struck first, treacherously, from behind, killing the man who had been the architect of many of his victories. This was not a fit of rage, as with Clitus. It was a cold, calculated, preemptive execution, a ritual purge that destroyed one of the most influential families in Macedonia and sowed the seeds of mistrust in the army. Everyone understood that loyalty was no longer a guarantee of safety. This insatiable hunger for power and control was fueled not only by paranoia, but also by a special philosophical poison that he himself had created: the concept of pothos. This Greek word means a passionate, almost divine desire for the unattainable. Alexander convinced himself, and tried to convince others, that he was not driven by a thirst for glory or wealth, but by this mystical pothos, the desire to reach the edge of the oikumene, to see what no mortal had ever seen. In reality, this was just a beautiful excuse for his demonic ego. He drove his army through deserts and mountains, forcing it to fight unseen enemies such as war elephants in India, not for the prosperity of Macedonia, but to satisfy this personal, irrational itch. The culmination of this madness was the famous halt at the river Giphasis in India. His army, exhausted to the limit, bloodied, tormented by tropical diseases and endless battles, rebelled. It was not a rebellion in the usual sense. The soldiers simply sat down on the ground and refused to go any further. They had reached their human limit. Alexander's reaction was not that of a commander, but of an offended deity. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing to come out and talk to anyone, hoping that his soldiers would be ashamed and crawl to him on their knees. When this did not happen, he was forced to give in. But even his retreat was turned into an act of self-affirmation, ordering 12 giant altars to be erected on the riverbank, surpassing in height the largest towers, as a monument to how far he had come. It was a monument not to the glory of the army, but to his own, albeit wounded, greatness. His contempt extended not only to people, but also to their beliefs. When conquering Babylon, he played the role of a liberator, promising to restore the temples desecrated by the Persians. But this was only a mask. His true attitude was revealed in the systematic plundering of temple treasures throughout the empire. He did not hesitate to melt down sacred artifacts and statues of gods into coins to pay his troops. In Babylon, he never restored the main ziggurat of Etemenanki, and according to some sources, He ordered the giant golden statue of the supreme god Bel-Marduk to be melted down. For the Babylonians, this was not just theft, it was the murder of a god, an act of the greatest blasphemy, a demonstration that there was only one deity worthy of worship, Alexander himself. This monstrous confidence in his own exceptionalism found expression in acts of genocide, which official history bashfully refers to as suppression of resistance. During the Indian campaign, while storming the city of Malus, Alexander was the first to climb the wall and was seriously wounded by an arrow in the chest. When he was carried away from the battlefield bleeding profusely, his army fell into a frenzy of rage. Breaking into the city, the Macedonians carried out a total massacre. They spared no one, neither warriors, nor old men, nor women, nor children. They killed everyone who crossed their path, avenging the wound of their deified commander. Plutarch writes that their anger was so fierce that they killed many thousands of Indians, including women and children. The life of one demigod was equated with the life of an entire people. And even after his death, his demonic essence continued to poison the world. When he died in Babylon, his commanders no longer thought about saving the king. They gathered at his bedside and argued about power. The body of the greatest conqueror in history lay unburied for several days in the hot Babylonian climate, because his heirs were too busy dividing up the empire, which had not yet cooled down. It was the apotheosis of cynicism and the logical outcome of his reign. He did not create a system, leave laws, or raise successors. His entire empire was held together solely by his personal will and the fear he instilled. As soon as he was gone, the Colossus collapsed. His legacy was not Hellenistic culture and prosperous cities, but 40 years of continuous war, in which his comrades enthusiastically destroyed each other, his family, and everything he had built. He was not a creator, but a comet, bright and destructive, leaving behind only scorched earth and a crater filled with blood. Even his grief took on monstrous, tyrannical forms. When his closest friend and possibly lover, Hephaestion, died, Alexander fell into a madness that shook the entire empire. He ordered the unfortunate doctor, who had failed to save his favorite, to be crucified, as if he were not a healer, but a god-killer. Total mourning was declared throughout Asia. All music was forbidden, sacred fires in temples were extinguished, and the manes of war horses and mules were shorn as a sign of mourning. The apotheosis of this necrotic ritual was the funeral pyre for Hephaestion in Babylon, which, according to Diodorus, cost 10,000 talents, an amount comparable to the annual budget of a small state. This was not just a farewell, but a demand that the world mourn with him. Otherwise, the world risked incurring his wrath. His justice was just as theatrical and cruel. He did not simply execute Darius's murderer, the satrap Bessus. He subjected him to Persian torture. His nose and ears were cut off, and then, according to one version, his body was torn to pieces by being tied to 2 bent trees. Alexander enjoyed the barbaric methods of his enemies, readily adopting them himself. The same ruthlessness was shown to his own people. During the mutiny in Opis, when the veterans finally demanded to be sent home, he did not try to persuade them. He went out to them, delivered a venomous speech full of reproach and contempt, and then ordered his bodyguards to seize and execute 13 instigators on the spot. After this blood-curdling spectacle, he arranged a feast of reconciliation, where he forced the Macedonians and Persians to drink from a common cup, sealing their unnatural alliance with blood and fear. Any manifestation of free will, whether it was the fatigue of the army or the death of a friend, became a personal insult to him, requiring an immediate and disproportionate response that blurred the line between king and demon god. The story of Alexander the Great is not just a tale of military victories and conquests. It is a narrative about a man who may have crossed the line between greatness and madness, between the divine and the demonic. Burned palaces, murdered friends, executed chroniclers, destroyed dynasties. These are all facts that cannot be disputed. Was Alexander a demon in human form? Hardly. But was he a tyrant intoxicated with power, a cruel despot whose ambitions knew no bounds? The historical evidence speaks for itself. Everyone decides for themselves who this man was, a great hero or a warning about what unlimited power in the hands of a single mortal who thought himself a god can lead to. That's all for now. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and see you